From the prevalence of the phrase, okay, boomer, to all the articles identifying which particular industry the millennials have decided to kill this week, the generation gap is alive and well. What is it that causes us to look at people older than us or younger than us and convince ourselves that they have no idea what's going on and everything that's wrong in the world is their fault? Well, we took a look at that and realized that that concept has been around for an awful lot of years. You can even find examples in Scripture. So let's head over there to that sermon.
I want us to jump to 1 Kings, and I'm going to give a little bit of background before we read this, because this, if we just read this, if we didn't sit with a little context, we might miss maybe the most important part of this, because we're about to hear about an absolutely pivotal moment, historically anyways, in the history of the ancient Israelites. So this is about King Rehoboam. Who's heard of King Rehoboam? Judas is like, yeah, okay, I have. He's not one of the most famous ones, though what he did was drastically significant. The actions we're about to hear today led to the severing of the kingdoms. Okay, so we know about the 12 tribes of Israel, and we always picture them as being all one group. Well, they were to start, but they actually weren't one group for most of what we call the Old Testament. And it was this event, or what happened right after this, that leads to it, which is critically important because King Rehoboam was a young man, a very young king, and as kings do, he surrounded himself with advisors. And what we're about to hear is when he asked for some wisdom, when the elderly advisors who had wisdom, who had stuck around through his dad's leadership, oh, I forgot to mention this, his dad was Solomon. Ever heard of him? So this is the first guy after the wisest king ever. That is critically important because the wisest king ever, one of the most important things that made him wise is he listened to the people around him. Now, don't get me wrong. He made some pretty critical errors in judgment, and because of that, there were some difficulties within the kingdom. But when his son rose to power, he said, no, I'm going to ignore all of the people who were the wise people who surrounded my dad and led Israel to its the most successful time of Israel's life. No, I'm going to sit around with the people who I know best, people who grew up in easy times, people who grew up in the palace of the richest king ever. Basically, he was an entitled, spoiled brat who listened to a bunch of other entitled, spoiled brats. So let's hear the words of Scripture. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard of it, for he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon, then Jeroboam returned from Egypt. And they sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, your father made our yoke heavy. Now, therefore, lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke that he had placed upon us, and we will serve you. He said to them, go away for 3 days, then come again to me. So the people went away. Then King Rehoboam took counsel with the older men who attended his father Solomon while he was still alive, saying, how do you advise me to answer this people? They answered him, if you will be a servant to this people today and serve them and speak good towards them when you answer them, then they will be your servants forever. But he disregarded the advice that the older men gave him and consulted with the young men that had grown up with him and now attended him. He said to them, what do you advise that we answer this people who have said to me, lighten the yoke that your father put upon us? The young men who had grown up with him and said, thus you should say to this people who spoke to you, your father made our yoke heavy, but you must lighten it for us. Thus you should say to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Now, whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the third day, as the king had said, come to me again on the third day. The king answered the people harshly. He disregarded the advice that the older men had given him and spoke to them according to the advice of the young men. My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. So the king did not listen to the people because it was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord had spoken by Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam, son of Nebat. When all Israel saw that the king would not listen to them, the people answered the king, "What share do we have in David? We have no inheritance with the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Look now to your own house, O David." So Israel went away to their tents. It could have been so easy. The wealthiest king ever could have said, "I don't really need more wealth." The weight that was put upon them was that they were to pay into the palace treasuries. He could have just backed it off. Instead, he severed a nation for all time. It'd be a shame if we just sat there. That's pretty heavy. So I want us to take a moment and read a totally different story, which happens only a few generations before. But this is a story about another generational connection, and it's a story of Ruth and Naomi. Now, we're only going to read 16 and 17 because that's like the final bit of the story, but I want to set this up for us. Now, we are going to read more about Ruth and Naomi and Orpah a little bit later in the summer. Actually, Judith is going to share this with us, so I don't want to steal all of your thunder on this one. Yeah, absolutely. But a little bit of history. Ruth was a Moabite woman, and the Moabites were the enemies of the Israelites. Now, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, had traveled into Moab and had married her sons off to Moabite women. So this was no efforts of Ruth other than she got married off when she was sitting around home and some foreigners showed up. Now, in some singularly bad luck, Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah's husbands all die in a short period of time. And now we have 3 women who have no hope of supporting themselves. That is unfortunately the reality of the time. And so it made the most sense for the women to part ways, for Orpah and Ruth to go back to their parents' houses and find perhaps new husbands for themselves, and for Naomi to head home and hopefully count on her townsfolk, who were the town of Bethlehem, to care for her. And Ruth said, and now we read what Ruth said to Naomi. "Do not press me to leave you or turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, even if death parts me from you." 2 generations of women who were separated by nationalities, who were only connected through 2 dead men. And her response was, "I will stand by you against all odds. I will go with you to a country where it is uncomfortable, where nobody will welcome me." Now, it would help with just the tiniest bit of stealing from the very end of the story, because at the end of this story, Ruth does have a little bit of success in her life. She does wind up with a husband, and they do wind up with a child. And that child has a child, and that child was King David. Just to kind of stitch these 2 stories together, we're only about 5 generations of people. Now, of course, because this is Old Testament, it's 5 generations of men, because they're the ones we bother to listen to in the Old Testament. These 2 stories, separated by relatively little time, speak of utterly different ways of addressing generational differences. The reason that we're talking about the generation gap today is because the generation gap was a significant part of conversation in the 1960s, and it is now. And it's one of these really wonderful circumstances where we can look back with hindsight being 50-50 and then look at ourselves in 2020. What was 50-50? What was that? Oh my goodness. Hindsight being 2020. I think we all just try and ignore 2020 for all reasons altogether. We look back at the generational gap and the frustrations that were being named by young people in the 1960s. There were frustrations like, Mom, Dad, you just don't understand. You're too tight around sexuality. We want to just have our own way. Mom, Dad, you don't understand. This plant grows naturally and you can roll it up and you can smoke it. It's not the end of the world. Mom, come on. Mom, Dad, you don't understand. You're sending me to a war that I have nothing to do with, and this is your fight and not mine, and my friends are dying. Generational gap was a significant thing in the 1960s. The funny part, maybe not funny, ha-ha, but the part that we need to look at with a really, really wide open set of eyes is that the mom, dad who were doing the talking, the kids who were talking in the 60s are the moms and dads and the grandmas and the grandpas of today. The next interesting part is the idea that Mom, Dad, don't you understand? Sexuality is something that we should be comfortable and open to talk about. Oh, shoot, am I talking about the 60s or am I talking about right now? Mom, Dad, don't you understand this? You know where we're going with this. And we still have young people today. Now, maybe not in our nation, but we have young people today in Eastern Europe who are sent to war to fight somebody else's battle. In Southeastern Asia. Throughout this world, it turns out that we maybe haven't learned much from the generation gap. And the one thing that the Bible tells us, and that we know intrinsically, is the best version of us as humanity is to do the opposite of King Rehoboam, is to actually listen to all voices. Now, I don't think that King Rehoboam would have done the right thing, or the fully right thing, if he had only listened to the older generation. The reality is, it was King Solomon's advisors who had helped him layer on the levels of oppression of his neighbors and his siblings and the fellow tribes. He was the one who had caused this to begin with. But to turn your back entirely on the wisdom that they had then also didn't work out. So what do we do with this? How do we work within a generational gap? How do we address this? Because I think it's gotten a bit worse. Who here knows the phrase, okay, boomer? Who here has ever said, those darn millennials? Who has ever read an article that picked and chose which industry or institution the millennials were choosing to kill today? Item after item, our media seems to be working to intentionally push us apart. So that young people would look to old people and say, yeah, but you have no idea the life I've lived. You won't even bother to open your email. And then we've got older people who are like, yeah, but you didn't even have to work for anything you got. Young people today, they don't even know what it's like to work. These conversations, and I say them with a hint of laughter, and that's absolutely intent. But these are real conversations that are happening. These are absolutely the articles that we read in newspapers and on Facebook feeds. These are the sorts of things that start to worm their way into our brains. And when we read people writing it, or when we listen to a podcast that says the same thing, when that's the content that we're consuming, then we start to believe it. We start to wrap up entire groups of people and make them, them, and us. Now, this might not be the first time I've ever stood on this platform and talked about how dangerous it is when we step into us and them, no matter what the line in the sand is, whether that be an age line or a race line or a sexuality line or a nationalistic line. There are any number of lines in the sand that as soon as we say that group is not us, but we are us, it is a dangerous and a slippery slope. Now, I don't really like very often to point blame, because anytime we stick to blame, it becomes really black and white. Like, oh, well, that's the thing that's the problem. And if we just fix that thing, then it makes it all better. Well, we know that none of humanity is anywhere near as simple as that. We humans are complex and messy, even as individuals. And then you get two humans in one space together, whoo, it gets messy in a hurry. But I do think that one thing that has changed significantly from a few generations before till now is the intent behind media. Now, we can blame media all we want, but we've got to remember that media is still controlled by a group of humans, and humans are messy. But it used to be, and I'm going to sound like a boomer right now. I'm going to sound older than or even my own age. It used to be that there was integrity in journalism. That goes right after, no, you kids get off my lawn. But the media that we consume has utterly changed, whether it be mainstream media or something that's just written by somebody in their basement on the internet. The way that we consume stuff has utterly changed, but what we as a society haven't bothered to do is change the way we read it. There was a day when there were so many layers of checks and balances before something came out on a radio station. Well, part of it was radio was bloody expensive to create. Television was terribly, even more expensive to create. So you wouldn't waste money on things that didn't really address the whole world. You had to be careful about what you said because it was meant to address the whole world. It was for everyone, or at least the whole world of who you were speaking to. Your audience was broad and it was wide. And so if you were in North America, you need to make sure that the news you were sharing was appropriate for everybody who would turn on the television or who would turn on the radio or open a newspaper. That hasn't existed for ages. Our news media is extremely narrow and focused on a particular group of people. There are so many different news outlets, whether they be public or private, whether they be just your friend who shared a podcast, all the way up to nationally syndicated news shows. They all have a very, very clear audience. And as time progresses, they get narrower and narrower because it's better for them. It keeps people engaged. It sells more ad revenue if you can keep somebody watching. And that stuff like Instagram and Facebook know better than anybody else. Which means the stuff we're taking in is aimed to keep us in our little groups. If I suddenly become a poor consumer of Group A's media, whatever that might be, then I'm no longer of use to them. I'm not going to sell their ad revenue, so I don't matter to them. It makes more sense to tell me the things that I already know and I already want to hear, because it's going to build up my confirmation and bias and I'm going to feel good about myself. And if I am young enough to hear lots of things that say, oh, boomer, and I get angry about an entire generation that's several years older than me, then I stay engaged and I'm really happy about it. Or if I'm reading stuff that has the shape of kids today just don't work, they don't know what it's like, they don't bother, then I like that because it fulfills my confirmation bias and I continue to read that. But how many of us, if we were to look at an individual in the group we're talking about, how many of us would actually believe that about any individual? Do I think that my parents are as awful as everything said about the baby boomers? No. Not every day. I mean, not on Father's Day. I certainly wouldn't say that on Father's Day. And if they look at me or my kids, do they believe all of the things that are said about Gen X or Millennials or Gen Alpha? No. In fact, the funny thing about generational theory is it breaks every time you narrow it down from being a group to being an individual. Start, and there's so much lovely proof of this, start by just finding out what age group any particular group is. Anybody have an idea of when the baby boomers are? Like, what are the age brackets? What's the birth year bracket? Anybody have any ideas? 45 to 65 is kind of common, absolutely. And then like 65, 68, 69. And do we start a little bit earlier than that because there's people who didn't fight in the war, but they're young enough to know about it, right? So we've got to put those brackets on. If you look at the numbers, they generally say millennials start in 80, except this one that says it's 77, and this other one that says it's 83. Now, I'm 76, which means I'm clearly none of them, except that there wasn't a television in my house until I was 16, so all of the media that the rest of the millennials were getting, the rest of the Gen X were getting, I didn't get. So then I'm a little bit more millennial than nobody actually fits any of the brackets. But for as long as we can group people into these big lumps and say, yeah, but you behave like that, then it makes it easier for us to dislike, to blame, to say, here's the reason and here's the problem. So how do we fix this? And it's actually more obvious than you would think. And it's actually something that we all already know. It's the same fix for any time we draw a line in the sand and put somebody in that group and us in this group. Get to know somebody in that group. They're already in your lives. You already actually know them. And work to unpeel those things. When you hear somebody say, thanks, boomer, think about the boomers in your life and see if they actually fit that category. When somebody says, this is all the fault of millennials, think of the millennials in your lives and see if they are anything like what that article says. If we look to Ruth, rather than looking to Rehoboam, we realize that it is through the relationships that the world grows in positive directions. And it's through closing down relationships and only believing and listening to the people who we know best and make us feel good about what we're already thinking. When we do that, it creates division. And in this case, it literally divides a country for all time. Some of us feel like we are living in the most divisive times ever. And actually, I might have even postulated that in a YouTube video about a month and a half ago. And I feel badly that I did because I don't actually think that. What we're living in is a time when our media speaks about division more than ever before. In researching this, it actually took me quite a bit of work to find really good articles from the 60s about the generation gap. Actually, the place where you find it is more in the artwork. Watching movies from that time frame, listening to music from that time frame, you get more of the discussion about those struggles between generations in that than you do in the media. It didn't matter as much to media then. Today, every second article, every second podcast is looking to blame another generation for what's going on. I don't actually think that we as humans have changed as much as we would think in 60 years. Well, partially, like I said in the very beginning, the young people today are still yelling at their parents for the same things as those parents yelled at their parents for when they were this age. Those things haven't changed much at all. I think the division that we're being fed is the thing that has changed. But that's actually good news, because that is very fixable. I want to wrap this up with what can only be described as a good news story. And some of you might know about this program because it crops up in different ways. It's a program, there's one specifically called Canada Housing Share, and there are lots of other ones that fit that way. But this one specifically exists in Peterborough and Kingston and Toronto, mostly in university towns. And what they do is they match elderly people who have a spare bedroom with young people who have moved to a new city to go to school. And it's a match, almost like Tinder sort of match. Like they work really, really hard to look at what people's joys and inspirations are, to look at what means things to them, and put people together. And it is one of these active ways that is utterly changing the generation gap. Now, it's only doing it 1 and 2 people at a time. But every single one of those stories will absolutely warm your heart. I would be lying if I didn't admit that I might have teared up a little bit reading some of the stories. Because what they generally sound like is the elderly person will talk about how they thought that they were fine living on their own. They were a strong and independent woman after their husband died. That's a fairly typical. And yet then they met this young person who brought them new life. They hadn't realized how alone they were. They hadn't realized how much they just needed somebody else to share their joys and their worries with. And then when you talk to a young person who is a little bit terrified, moving out of their parents' home for the first time, moving away from all the friends that they know into some city that's halfway across the province, and the worst case scenario would meet some boomer who's going to tell them exactly what to do, and they realize that she's the grandma she never knew she had. Or he's the wacky great uncle. We can utterly change this brokenness within our society, and we can do it one at a time. We can do it by following Ruth rather than Rehoboam. We can do it by recognizing the media that gets pumped towards us does not particularly have our best interest at heart. We can do it by looking at all the people that we see around us right here today and recognize the them in them is all part of us. Amen.
Thank you so much for joining me this morning to discuss the generation gap. And hopefully you come away from that with a little more awareness and maybe a little more empathy, spend a little more time wondering exactly where you fit in the bigger scope of age of people around you. And are you following some of the same old patterns? Let's make a better world by changing us and maybe encouraging those around us to be a little more empathetic and build up intergenerational relationships. If this is the sort of content you like, I invite you to click over there. There's a previous sermon, or even better, why don't you subscribe, click the notification bell, and YouTube will let you know when I upload the next video. I love you all. I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.